morning, everybody. Good to see you all, and particularly on a Saturday when there's so many other things you could be doing. And the sun's shining, as you're saying. You're in for a treat. Today, we're going to have a very special person, but I want to first introduce myself. I'm Mary Pendergreen, and I am Chief of Social Work Services at the Jewish Board. I'm also president of the New York City chapter of the National Association. Thank you, and we are truly in for a treat. Cheryl Franks is someone that I've known for a lot of years. She's been a steadfast person in the field of social work for a long time. She's very involved with NASW, has been. And the minute that the subject of race and race matters come up, Cheryl is immediately thought of and mentioned because of her commitment to the issues. Cheryl started talking about, originally in the 80s, she was dealing with multiculturalism, but in the 90s, she was the first person that I heard that was talking about being white and white racial identity. And I recall personally calling her in, and people were really seeing it as very revolutionary, and lots of people didn't like what she had to say. But I think the wonderful thing about her and all of you is the willingness to deal with things that people may not necessarily want to hear. And indeed, Cheryl has been at Columbia for quite a long time and is currently there in the School of Social Work as well as in the School for International Affairs. So please welcome Cheryl and open your mind for a wonderful treat. Dr. Cheryl Franks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. First, I want to thank the members of the Anti-Racist Alliance, particularly Mary and Sandy, for organizing today's event. And it's so important. And I feel so humbled and honored to follow David Billings, to be in the hot seat, kind of, literally. So it's a little hot. And so I'm so honored and humbled. And I do have a little bit of a cold, so I'm nasal to begin with, and now I'm from Cleveland, so now I'm going to really sound nasal. Actually, what happened was I was doing multicultural training, and it was 1990, and I was asked to come and speak, and I remember that there was a panel, and an Indian American woman was asked to speak about Indian American issues, and an African American man, African American issues, and a Japanese American woman, Japanese American issues, and then they looked at me and they said, just talk about multicultural. So it was kind of like that, boom. It was like, well, what about my race? What about my skin color? What does that mean? What kind of meaning does it have? And that kind of propelled me to move most exclusively into the area of what it means to be white. So before I begin, I really feel that it's my responsibility to kind of call the name many people of color who have mentored me over the last 20 years, and why I sit here is really because of them. So can you close your eyes? If you could hear with your eyes closed, can you close your eyes as I call their name? Paige Cook, Robert Carter, Karina Walters, Janet Helms, Sam Johnson, Ann Johnson, Randall Robinson, Daryl Wheeler, Philip Berry, Mary Pendergreen, and Clarina Moultrie. Thank you. So let me tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from, and to do this, and also it's a really good example of how a person of color has mentored me and been there for me. So this is a true story. A couple years ago, do any of you go to the APA, the American Psychological Association conference? It was in Boston a couple years ago. Jesse Jackson spoke to 4,000 people. He was amazing, and one of the things he said was, why don't you white folks study each other? Why are you always studying us? Right? And my sponsor, Karina, who is a Choctaw Indian from Oklahoma, said to me, raise your hand and tell them that you're a white person studying white people. And I said, because my research was in that area and I was writing my dissertation at that time, and she was my sponsor, and I said, I'm not, no. So we go into the reception, and there he is. So she said, you have to go up and tell them you're a white person studying white people. So I said, Karina. So, okay, so I went up, and she's behind me, and I said, hi, I'm a white person studying white people. And he said, blah, blah, blah. And I said, what? And what I heard him say was blah, blah, blah. And it's like the biggest fear of white folks that we're going to be in a conversation with people of color, and we're not going to understand what they said. So he said, blah, 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 is what I heard. And I said, what? And this went on. And I just wanted to die. So finally I heard him say, where are you coming from? And then it was a whole nother, I was like, how am I going to talk about my theoretical framework in 2 seconds? What is my theory? And it just was out of my head. What is it? And what am I going to do? And how am I going to say it? And how can I convey it? And I only have a second. And he's staring at me. And what am I going to do? And he finally said, where are you coming from? And I said, and finally Karina's voice from behind me whispered in my ear, Columbia University, New York City. And I said, Columbia, and he said, finally. so thank you, Karina. Okay, we're going to talk about white, I'm going to do the stages of white. People have heard me talking about white racial identity for a long time. I'm going to do the stages, but first I want to do a reflective piece that actually I wrote at the time that I was writing my dissertation, but it didn't get in my dissertation because it wasn't rigorous enough, but I love it and I feel it in my soul when I talk. And actually a couple of you have heard me, so, you know, Harriet and Mary for sure. And so I want to read kind of this reflective piece that really talks more about the problem, then we could go into what I see as one of the solutions, white racial identity. I also want to say that, you know, we all know self-awareness is the hallmark of cross-cultural competence. I mean, for 4 decades, counseling psych has told us that self-awareness is the hallmark. And the social work literature says that self-awareness is the hallmark for cultural competence, and you have to begin with that. I just like us to define self-awareness very broadly, right? So I wanted to include values, right? Attitudes, behaviors, certainly. Also within and between group differences, power and privilege statuses, multiple statuses, intersectional identities, looking at dominance, oppression, privilege, and advantage, looking certainly at homophobia, but also heterosexual privilege, looking certainly at racism, but also what's the cost and the damage to whites as perpetrators and beneficiaries of racism. So really seeing it broadly, double consciousness, the impact of historical trauma and race-based trauma. So really very broad definitions of self-awareness. Now, why is it important, and understanding ourselves as a racial being, and really building on what David said, you know, we don't do that. And we're going to talk more about that and really look at what, you know, the stages of white racial identity, how it supports that idea. But I want to say 2 reasons why I think it's very important for us to think about this. And first, race is, and the literature now really supports this, it's really a part of human development, right? Mental health and personality. So I always tell my students, never again do I want to hear you say, is that personality or is that race? Is that personality, is that culture? As if we can develop our personality separate from our experience as we move through the world in terms of our skin color, right? So it is part of, it's not just a socioeconomic variable, right? It is human development and mental health. Secondly, I think that it's really important to understand white racial identity and to really support ourselves as we move through the stages, because I don't really think that we can do the best, we could commit in the best ways to an undoing racism agenda unless we're in a better place in our own white racial identity. But I also think that participating in the undoing racism workshops and in hearing you speak today is one of the interventions that, that we need to do more research about. What are these interventions? But clearly multicultural orientation, multicultural training, these kind of activities are ways to move us in our racial identity. So I don't want to say, wait till you're in a better place in your racial identity to engage. They kind of and folks are shaking their head. Okay, so we don't seem to have a very good understanding, those of us who are white, of what that means, and we've been supported not to think about it, right? We're very supported not to think about it. So bear with me as I kind of read some of my reflections before we actually go into the stages of white racial identity development. Throughout much of the social work profession, clients are of visible racial and ethnic groups while counselors are white, right? And yet there is little opportunity or encouragement, let alone accountability for white social workers to examine their own identity and racist attitudes, and in particular their whiteness in relation to its impact on assessments, interventions, counseling, relationships, all kind of relationships, program development, community organizing, organizational development. The social dynamics of racism continue to be perpetuated in the social work profession by social workers who are unaware of their of themselves as racial beings, and the literature really supports this. Paralleling society at large, as whites, we are rarely required to see ourselves as racial beings or having a racial identity, nor have we had to examine the impact of our whiteness on professional relationships. We have not had to examine issues of white privilege and advantage and how these realities play out in discrimination and the economic and educational state of affairs. As whites, we see racism as individual acts of meanness, not as dominance of one group over another, which serves to maintain the status quo. And that's, you could hear Peggy McIntosh's voice in what I'm saying, right? In this way, we rarely see ourselves as contributing to racism by benefiting from these systems of dominance. It's difficult to understand how race can be ignored when race or skin color is such a salient dimension of one's experience in the world, how one is perceived, welcomed, responded to. It's pretty safe to say that skin color is significant in shaping one's movement through the world. It walks a person down the street, into stores, into taxis, into meetings, into the classroom, into the counseling session, and at times blocks one's passage to these places. Into this room also, right? It walked me into this room. It shapes the perception others make about a person and how they then respond, and then it influences one's view of oneself. As a white woman, I have never asked if I am the maid or the delivery person. People I've only spoken with on the phone do not have a look of surprise on their face when for the first time they see me and the color of my skin. I can walk down the street without having people cross the street when they see me. People do not clutch their purse or get out of the elevator when I get on. And even more important, I am not afraid to get on the elevator alone with someone for fear that they might misinterpret any of my actions. I can go into a store without being followed, oftentimes treated with more respect and courtesy than an individual of color, waited on first, treated with the expectation that I have money to spend. And at times I can be pretty sure that the advertisements and at the same time, I could be pretty sure that the advertisements in that store will mainly represent someone of my race. I can fool around outside with a water gun and not be shot. And when I present, I really never have. Folks might say, oh, that was great, that was terrific, but no one says you were so articulate. On the contrary, I am greeted warmly. I experience much unearned advantage simply due to the color of my skin, and I am spared daily, moment by moment, continuous micro attacks on my being based on my skin color. I feel mostly cared for, responded to well because of my skin color, instead of having to cope with the stress of these daily attacks or microaggressions, as Elaine Pinderhughes refers to them. I have dinner with a friend of mine, a dark-skinned black male who is a full professor with a PhD from Teachers College, Columbia University. The waitress looks only at me as she takes the order. I pay the check with a check and I'm not asked for an ID. My friend says this would never happen to him. We leave and we cannot hail a taxi unless I do it alone. Are these examples of racism? Yes, but also examples of white privilege that I did nothing to earn. I am somehow and for the most part cloaked in comfort by a world that is aggressive to my friend. I am free from the exhaustion, fear, and insanity of always having to consider what is the racial angle. Without considering myself a dominant person based on my skin color, I have been granted the unearned privilege of dominating from birth. And I remain mainly unaware of this privilege and then the grave responsibility that comes from it. For my friend and I, if the scene continued, our stories of the walk home to our apartments would reveal much more about the different ways we are treated. These are just a few of the moment-to-moment, hour-by-hour, day-by-day experiences that we as whites take for granted. These examples illustrate the respect, the reactions that are afforded to us. If we are unaware of the privilege that is bestowed upon us for no reason other than our whiteness, how then are we aware of the experience of someone of a different skin color? And if we aren't aware, how are we able to truly understand the experience of those folks that we serve? And I hypothesize that we must first be aware of our privilege to fully understand the absence of that privilege and the toll that this takes on the individual. So how is it that we as whites fail to see ourselves as racial beings? I can answer this question based on my own experience as a white woman and my observations, anecdotal data, and my research that, that I've been participating in over the last couple decades. First of all, whites are rarely asked to, and you'll hear David's voice in this, and it's interesting because I wrote it way before, but first of all, whites are rarely asked to look, we're rarely asked to look at our whiteness. We don't have to. Even in multicultural training, the emphasis is on looking at those of visible racial and ethnic group membership. And when we as whites are asked to look at our culture, we often skip race, and I call it the leap over race, and it's the and but, right? And define ourselves as ethnic, while we see others of visible racial and ethnic groups as racially different but not possessing an ethnic identification. It is in this leap that we can learn much. Even the literature on race, and I really support you, go and get books on race and ethnicity. That literature, you'll find headings like Native Americans, Black Americans, Asian Americans, racial groups, right? And then Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Jewish Americans, ethnic groups. And these are books on race and ethnicity. White American is rarely listed as a group. Whites are discouraged to think of themselves as racial beings, to explore their status and to examine the meaning of whiteness. Now, I say a little bit about the history. I did begin in the 80s with doing multicultural training, and I was pretty much acknowledged as someone who was, a competent and expert in multicultural organizational development. What I find fascinating is I was able to become or to be thought of as an expert in multicultural practice and multicultural organizational development without ever having to think about what it means to be white. That, I think, is fascinating. And is it not a privilege of being white that allows one to ignore this privilege? Whiteness is seen by whites as normal or normative, again, McIntosh, invisible, just there, but nothing that really defines me. I know for myself, when the taxi passes up a black male and stops for me, I used to think of the driver as racist and the black male as a victim of discrimination. I would always tell the driver that I was reporting him or her and offer the cab to the black male. But never did I see myself as privileged, benefiting from the discrimination, or a product of a system that overprivileges me when I do nothing to earn it. At times like this, I feel bad about the situation, but good about myself because I helped the victim. I end up with a sense of goodness derived from someone else's victimization. In this case, the door opens for me, but I won't get in. But how many times each day do doors open for me because of my skin color and not on my merit? And how many times am I supported to remain oblivious to this privilege? And while remaining oblivious, how many decisions concerning race do I make all the time? When picking a graduate school, I chose Columbia University. This was, among other things, a racial decision. Never did it enter my mind to go to Howard University. Indeed, it is difficult for us as whites to examine our whiteness and the impact it has on our lives. We think it is rarely a consideration in our day-to-day lives. The choice for Columbia had racial considerations, and yet I never had to think about it as a decision which does. The second reason it's easy for us to ignore this important dimension of our identity is because in doing so, not only do we have to wake up to a privileged status, but we also have to define ourselves as the oppressor. In my work over the last couple decades, I found that when most folks define their cultural identity, they define themselves in the role of the oppressed rather than the oppressor. So women focus on gender. Jewish Americans focus on their identification as a Jew and not a member of the white racial group. Gays and lesbians focus on their sexual orientation. It is rare that a white woman would identify as white, or that any group would identify with a dimension of culture that places them in the role of oppressor. It is much easier to identify with the oppressed. It protects us from having to see ourselves as contributors in dominance of one person over another. We even have a language that supports the oppressed and denies the oppressor. We think in terms of the underclass rather than the overclass, the underprivileged rather than the overprivileged. Okay, and I want to say, I wrote this a few years ago, and I'm in a somewhat of a different, my thinking is kind of expanded. I still think this has meaning, but I want to say that I then ended up only thinking of myself in the role of the oppressor. and I was denying some of, so it's only more recently that I'm able to now begin to think about what does it mean to be a woman. So I also, so it's all, you know, and I do think we have to tease out race. For those of us who identify as white, we have to, or we will take that leap over it. But the goal is really the looking at intersectional identities and how your racial identity status informs your gender, informs your sexual orientation, you know, multiple statuses. So, and if we begin to examine ourselves as racial beings, then we eventually uncover the reality of white supremacy and privilege. Helms writes of the need that whites have to protect their assumed privileged status and how they do so by denying and distorting race-related reality and aggressing against perceived threats to the racial status quo. Now that I've evoked Helms' name, I'm going to stop right now with this piece, and I want to move us. You know, Janet Helms is really the architect of, very involved in black racial identity in the 70s, but is really the architect with Robert Carter of white racial identity. So I want to use this time now to really begin to outline what is white racial identity, what are the stages, and the statuses and the phases attached, and why is it meaningful for the work we do and our commitment to undoing racism. So you know, I know some of you know that in the early 70s, I think, the black racial identity theory emerged. And it was Thomas Barham and Janet Helms and all those folks. Actually, as I'm calling their names, they're at Teachers College right now at the Cross-Cultural Roundtable. And there's a number of us who are going to leave here later today and go. Bell Hooks will be presenting there. It's the 21st year of the Roundtable. So Janet, Tom Parham, influenced by Bill Cross, developed black racial identity theory. And it was really kind of a developmental stage theory that really began to help us look at within group differences instead of looking at the black race, the white. What are the within group differences and what are the developmental tasks to a more authentic and more self-actualized place of racial identity. So what happened was, after no one made any fuss about black racial identity, but no one was doing anything about white racial identity, so Janet and Robert, who are African Americans, said, let's do white racial identity. Let's develop the theory and the scale and begin to measure it. And for those of you who are interested, there's this whole body of literature where all of a sudden white researchers from the West woke up and began to really criticize not only the construct validity of the scale, but then also the theory, and really wanted to throw out the theory and the scale. And if you go to the literature, it's fascinating because they're actually arguing in the literature, and they have very catchy titles like, well, a rose by any other name is a rose. And it's all in the literature, this real battle. And one of the most significant things is that Janet says, you know, the white researchers from the West, they can really use this moment to really think about their own racial identity. And why now are they waking up, and why now are they attacking us on something instead of building up? You know, so it really, what do they say? That life imitates art and research and theory imitates life. And so white racial identity was born, and there are different models. I'm going to talk about Helms and Carter's model today because it's been most empirically tested. Over 100 studies on white racial identity, looking at the relationship between white racial identity and all kind of variables of mental health and human development. Mine is on self-esteem. There's moral development, self-concept. So really, over the last 4 decades, lots of work. My research also supported the construct validity of the scale. There's some disagreement in the literature about the scale's construct validity, but it's really been mostly upheld. And there's also, it's wide open. There's plenty more to do. And so it's still, you know, it's still, all of us can continue to contribute to the research, and I support, especially folks who identify as white, as thinking about participating in moving it forward. It has 2 phases. The theory has 2 phases, and the first phase is the abandonment of racism. And there's 3 stages attached. Now, I'm going to use the word stage. Janet later used the word status because stage implied kind of only linear movement, and that it was mutually exclusive. So she really, stage might imply that, but it's not. And it will sound developmental, it will sound like there is, but you can go back and forth, you could skip over a stage, and you can have attitudes, values, and behaviors in different stages, so it's not mutually exclusive, okay? And that's why she moved to statuses. I'll continue to use the word stage. The first phase has 3 stages in it. It's abandonment of racism. The second phase has 3 stages in it, and that's defining a non-racist white identity. Okay, stage 1 is contact. The theory suggests that folks that are in stage 1, you hear things, I don't see race. Have you ever heard that before? A person of color walks in someone's room and they say, well, I don't see race. I don't see race, the goal is to be colorblind. Why can't we just all get along? Let's hold hands and sing We Are the World. You know, the legislation out of California, and a lot of the movement in this country, let's be color, as if we can be, as if it's good for us. So attached to that stage is really denial, right? Now, the theory suggests that something happens. The research tells us that some of the things that happen might be your identification in an oppressed group. So gay or lesbian folks, women, and the theory suggests that it might also be multicultural training, undoing racism training. There's not enough research in this area of what is it, how, we need to do much more, but something happens. Students come to New York City to the School of Social Work. They go through a one-day multicultural training. It shifts people out of that contact phase into the next phase, which is disintegration. Your world begins to disintegrate. I realize that racism exists. I realize it. I never knew it. I realize that racism exists. So again, it's not so much identifying as white, but I realize, and I like to equate this with the first time you found out about sex. Does everyone in here know about sex? Okay, I don't want to be like teaching, telling everyone. Okay, it's like, remember that first time, oh my God, you learn about sex, and you're like, oh my God, you have sex, you have sex, you have sex, and your whole world. Well, sometimes white folks in stage 2 disintegration, we are like that. It's kind of like, oh my God, racism exists. Oh my God, it's there, it's there, it's there, it's there. And we can be taxing on people of color. Also attached to that stage is pretty much, now I'm ready. I understand it exists, teach me. And I'm kind of through saying we should stop saying teach me, but let's just assign workload credit to it, okay? I think people of color can teach white people, but we need to out it, to bring it out of the closet, to assign workload credit to it, because it happens all the time, right? But also, and also there is a body of literature that really examines and explores, well, what's the cost of having to teach white folks? What's the cost, the emotional cost, the time cost, the resource cost? So, but at that stage, it is more, I understand it exists, now teach me. Also, at that stage, it's very much guilt and shame. I understand it exists, I feel a tremendous amount of guilt and shame. And if you think about your students, your colleagues, yourself, you could think about this. Attached to that stage is a lot of, oh my God, I feel such guilt, I want to help those poor victims, right? I want to help the other. Also attached to that stage is a lot of anxiety in cross-racial interactions, okay? Anxiety and discomfort. Not fear and rage, that'll be next. Anxiety and discomfort. So think about that, how it impacts your relationships, your interactions, your communication with people of color, our clients. Think about that. So, and I'll talk later about how you could use the stages of white racial identity and all racial identity to kind of predict what might happen in these interactions. So at that place, it's discomfort, it's anxiety with people of color. It's students going home for Thanksgiving and now saying, hey, I know racism exists, and family and friends are saying, you know what, we liked you better the other way. Now the theory really talks about, if you don't get support at that stage, you're in big trouble, because you're going to need to do something, right, to relieve the guilt and shame, right? How do you manage? So how do folks manage that guilt and shame? One way of managing it, the theory suggests, is by projecting it then, moving now to the next stage, reintegration. So first is contact. I understand racism exists. Now disintegration. My world is falling apart. The world as I knew it and was supported to believe it. And now reintegration. I'm pulling myself back together. And that's a place where I need to project back. My family didn't own slaves. Well, if only they didn't have so many children, you know, and we're very much supported. So if you don't get the support in the other direction, you're going to really have a lot of support available to really be able to do. And the projection, it's a stage of projection. It's also a stage of a lot of fear and anger towards people of color. So that's what the theory suggests. Now the theory, and those are the first three stages, and that's abandonment of racism. The theory suggests you pretty much can never completely go home, but folks can stay at that stage or go back to guilt and shame without a lot of support. Now, the second phase, which is the defining a non-racist white identity, begins with, and this could happen 10 years later, it could happen a month later, it could never happen, but it begins with whites saying, okay, there is something to this. There's something to this, and I'm not satisfied sitting with the guilt and shame. I'm not satisfied with the anger, I'm not satisfied. I know I can't deny it anymore. I need to explore more. What does it mean to be white? What is that? Separate from folks of color. What does it mean to be white? What is this white identity? And at that stage, it's pseudo-independence. It's an intellectual journey to understand that. So you'll see whites reading a lot. You'll see whites engaged in support groups, but really support groups where you read the literature and you talk about the literature. It's not an emotional place. Now, significant, my research showed that if students did not move from this place of this intellectual understanding to a more emotional place by the end of a year, that correlated highly with low self-esteem. So here we go. This is very useful in terms of our own development. You know, this is mental health. This is human development. This is personality, right? Pseudo-independence, also some of the attitudes attached to that stage, which are very dangerous, are not only, I feel guilt and shame, I want to help these poor victims, but the way to, at this stage, it's the way to help these poor victims is to help them to be more like me. So, you know, very dangerous stage. And as I'm talking, you know, you could think about folks and think of, if you have students, think about students. The next phase is immersion. It's a real emotional place to be. I tried to write my my theoretical framework when I was at that place, and I wrote like 700 pages. I couldn't stop writing. Karina finally said, "You cannot write anything else." It's just, you know, writing emotionally. You'll see whites form support groups to really talk about the emotional. I can tell a little story of when I feel like I was pretty much located. I went up to, I was white, thinking all the time about white. And I went up to the corner. I put, you know, the computer on hold, and I went up to the sleep or whatever it is. I went up to the corner to Haagen-Dazs to buy a birthday cake for a friend of mine because I was going to go to a birthday. And, you know, I said to the woman who was Puerto Rican, how many people does this cake serve? And she said, 6 white people. And I said, 6 white people to I said, oh my God, I'm writing about being white, and I'm writing no one talks about it, and it's not in our interactions, and here's a Puerto Rican woman, she's saying white, and she's saying white to me, and what does that mean? And no one talks about it, and here she's talking about it. Does it mean that Puerto Ricans eat bigger pieces than whites, or whites eat bigger pieces? And she's looking at me like this crazy woman, and I go, oh my God, 6 white people, I can't believe you said 6 white people. She goes, I didn't say 6 white people, I said 6 to 8 people. It's right up the street. I cannot go by it. I'm like the crazy white woman. I have to, you know, every time I go by it, I have to go around the coast. So that's immersion. You know, you're really totally immersed. What's the meaning of this? What's the meaning of my whiteness? And how has it shaped me? How does it link to, you know, the last stage is, I know. The last stage is, right. The last stage is, I sometimes wonder if we'll ever really get there, but I think we can have attitudes and values and behaviors in that stage. It's autonomy, which is, I think, an interesting label, and it's a place where you feel comfortable being white. You don't necessarily rejoice or celebrate it, but you feel comfortable. You could actually identify with some white role models that you're proud of. Susan Sarandon, Walt Whitman, David Billings. You know, I'm proud sometimes, and you could feel comfortable. But you are committed to actively combating racism for 2 reasons. Not only because you know that it damages and is hurtful for all of us, and it damages people of color, but you know that it damages whites. So you're really able to understand the damage, and that's where all the literature comes in on the impact of racism on white Americans as the beneficiaries and the perpetrators. What are the costs? Less ability to tolerate ambiguity, less ability to be self-reflective, anxiety. So there's all kind of costs both to individuals and to organizations, and you really understand that literature. And I would like my work to continue to really be some historical trauma and race-based trauma around dominance. I think that we need to do that work. There's some race-based literature out there. Actually, Karina Walters, for people of color, Karina Walters is doing that work, the historical trauma. Peggy's doing some of that work, Peggy O'Neill over here. And Robert Carter presented yesterday, what is the psychological and emotional impact of racism for African Americans? So some of it's, but we need to really look at, well, what's a personality of dominance? What's the cost of being supported by systems and participating in systems of dominance? And I think if already we know less ability to tolerate ambiguity, less ability to be authentic, think about how that impacts our relationships, our interactions, our work with our clients and communities. Finally, there is a body of work in Helm's original book in 1990 on black and white racial identity, which really helps us to look at, well, if we know where a person is in their racial identity, and this could be black racial identity, people of color racial identity, there's some work on Japanese racial identity, gay and lesbian identity. If we understand that, both the client, the counselor, the community leader, the community member, we can make predictions on, if we know where folks are in their racial identity, we can make predictions in terms of engagement, in terms of assessment, in terms of interventions, outcomes, terminations. So we could really, it's very useful. And I think that's why the commitment out of counseling psych, particularly Teachers College, is not about white counselor, white therapist. It's really, where is someone in their racial identity? And the worst you could have is when the counselor is at a lower place in their racial identity than the client, right? And if what I'm really laying out here is that we don't have an opportunity. So many of us are white who are doing this work. So many of the clients are folks of color. If we don't have the opportunity or understand the need to really understand ourselves as racial beings, then clearly we're probably going to be at a lower place in our racial identity than the client. And that has all kind of real implications for failed relationships. But we do have a way of handling that. We say non-compliance, so we really have to take a look at how it impacts on all of our professional relationships and obviously personal relationships. So I just love being able to share this work and my thinking, and every time I learned so much today from David, and I know it'll inform my work more, and I just really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I really want to support. I want to get more support for myself to continue this work, and I really want to support other folks to join with me in doing that. So thank you. I feel like I'm